right, there you have it, the announcement we've been waiting for all morning. Senator Rand Paul announcing that he is running. He is a candidate for president in 2016. We're joined again by Steve Chaggaris, Anthony Salvanto, and John Dickerson in D.C. Let's go to Steve right away. What'd you think?
Well, I thought it was interesting. There were a lot of things that he said in this speech that you hear a lot of Republicans talk about. Limited government, freedom, balancing the budget, cutting spending. But what was interesting here is I really think that he had a lot to prove in terms of his views on national defense and foreign policy. He's being attacked already for being weak on this. And you heard him use words like robust national defense, undefeatable. He spoke out specifically on the Iran deal, which is something that he hasn't done. All of his other competitors have. And he's out there pretty aggressively on the Iran deal. And so this is an opportunity for him to sort of talk a little bit to the establishment Republicans, to the GOP leaders that he's been at odds with, to say, look, I'm a more Republican than you think. I'm not as weak on national defense and foreign policy, while also throwing the classic red meat on these other issues.
Let's bring John Dickerson in. At the same time, he also is trying to sell himself as an outsider of Washington. Was he successful, John?
Well, we don't know at the moment if he was successful, but I think he, if he is going to grow the party, if he is going to bring people in, so he's got two challenges. He's got to bring in enough people to win in the Republican contests, and then he's got to also argue that he has a kind of special election, a general election kind of magic that can bring in voters who have not traditionally turned to Republicans. I think his best chance at that, from what he said today, is when he talked about special interests and the system being rigged, and the fact that the rich keep getting richer and that everyone else is being left behind. That sentiment is in the land. There are a lot of people who would nod to that defined sentiment. The question, though, is if he'll keep talking about that, if he'll keep hitting that note, which has a broader audience that would agree with it, and then B, when he then has solutions that would change that situation as it is, an economic playing field that's rigged for the wealthy. Do people sign up to his solutions? If he's going to do this broadening adventure, that would seem to be the best inroad in terms of what he laid out today.
Anthony, in his statements there, the senator said that too often when Republicans have won, we've squandered the victory by becoming part of the Washington machine. Clearly a way to distinguish himself as the anti-establishment candidate, but does he leave himself open, as we've been talking all morning long, to the very same criticism that Republicans have had about Barack Obama, that he has no experience, executive experience?
Yeah, Vlad, he might. But one of the things that struck me, too, is this use of the term both parties.
Yeah, he kept saying that.
You know, and we talked a little bit before the speech of how does he differentiate himself to get the Republican nomination. This looked to me immediately like one place. You know, we see polls where 7, 8, and 10 voters of all stripes are frustrated with Washington, frustrated with both parties. So there's definitely a vote-rich group there, but also I'm thinking of all the independents who can vote in places like New Hampshire, in places like South Carolina, that might appeal to. So maybe down the road, that theme of both parties, yeah, he can get some votes out of that for sure.
And Steve, he definitely talked about revitalizing inner cities and going after heavily Democratic parts of the country, Detroit, Chicago. How do you think that will play out? Well,
it's interesting. He referenced MLK's Two Americas, which, as we all know, that's something that John Edwards did in 2008 as well. It's just sort of interesting to hear a Republican talking about this. I think he's trying to set himself apart. He's talking about economic populism. He's not the only one in the Republican Party that's talking about this. You get, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker, even Rick Santorum, and even Jeb Bush to a certain extent, talking about this populism in terms of getting people back on track in terms of the economy. I think he's trying to set himself apart in a way from those guys by saying, I can talk to a broader audience on this issue. It's not just about the economic populism, but it's about talking to all Americans.
And will they respond? That'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, and I also thought it was interesting that he seemed to indicate by saying, when he was talking about Iran, he does believe in trust but verify. not letting them get the path to the bomb. But that's sort of what President Obama has been saying all along, right? That Iran is going to be the most verified country in the history of the world.
It is, but he's also been sort of nodded to where the Republicans are on this and saying, you know, he opposes any deal that doesn't stop nuclear production. And he's added this, you know, Congress must approve any deal that the president puts forth. So I think he's leaned a little bit more to where the Republicans are on this than where he was, I think, before, and in fact, this past week, not saying anything at all. So,
John, I'm curious. You mentioned before the speech that he was going to have to basically run. He was going to run on a movement, basically, which is what Barack Obama did. Do you think this speech kind of started that?
Well, it's funny, in Republican politics right now, there's a line that everybody's using, which is, I'm no community organizer, which is a shot at the president. But what Rand Paul described today, and in some sense what Ted Cruz is running on, is a community organizing model, which is to say, you influence the lawmakers and the people in power by creating a movement outside of that. And then that movement is so big and strong that it forces them, the lawmakers, to do the right thing. So he's going to organize a community, and that community is going to be, you know, big and vibrant. And it's how you run as an outsider when you are on the inside. So it's a good, you know, it's a good pitch. He's certainly got people there who would. There is a core group of Paul supporters who are quite vocal and really have all the elements of a movement. But that's a small group. So he has, to use the cliches of politics right now, he has a floor. Which is to say that he's got a group of supporters who'll never go below that floor. But the question is, where is his ceiling? Does he not pass a certain threshold with voters that means he can never get above some percentage? And that takes us again back to foreign policy. And I think if you look at his message on domestic policy and his message on foreign policy, it's about trust. So in the domestic sphere, he's saying, nobody is a greater defender of liberty than I am. And there are people who absolutely believe that, because that has been his long career. When people were kind of laughing at the idea of auditing the Fed, well, the Paul family was in support of that. When people were not listening about surveillance, you know, Rand Paul was talking about it. He has credentials built up over long experience on the kind of liberty question about domestic affairs. But on foreign policy, it works against him, which is to say, anybody worried about a dangerous and changing world will still have doubts about him, because there are other candidates who can say, look, I've always held these positions which are in support of a very strong national defense. And of course, Senator Paul is trying to wipe away those doubts with his remarks today and some of the other things he said. But the question is whether rhetorically you can wipe away those doubts when the presidency is an unpredictable office and where basically people are voting for what you will do in the future when you're in a pinch. In a pinch on liberty, people have a long track record to measure him against. In a pinch on national security, his record is more confusing and more mixed.
John, it sounds like we were talking earlier to our executive producer, Moshe, about these sort of three pillars that you need to win this nomination. You need the economic, you need the foreign policy, and you need the social. It sounds like you're saying that he's got the other two, but he may be sort of lacking on that foreign policy issue.
Right. Now, you can, some people now argue that there are four legs to the Republican stool, that there's a kind of libertarian kind of leg. The question for him is, how much do you need to win in some of these places? In other words, if you've got two of the three or two of the four or three of the four, however you want to slice it, in a crowded field, that might be enough. And so that floor and ceiling I talked about, his floor is higher than a lot of his opponents at the moment. And so he's got a good base of support to build from. And if, depending on how the field shakes out, we don't know yet what victory looks like in this crowded field. So that's a good place for him to start. But as the primaries and caucuses roll on and the numbers of competitors dwindle, will he run into a problem that, say, Rick Santorum ran into, which is in 2012, he had a strong base, a real core of people who wanted to support him, but then he could never kind of get that number any higher.
All right. Well, speaking of other candidates that are going to announce their run, is Jeb Bush, and he has commented on this speech. Let's listen in.
Libertarianism definitely has a place in the GOP. We all share a common belief that we need to limit government's power. We need to create an economy that grows, where people can make choices for themselves, that freedom is the bedrock principle of this great country of ours. I do think there's some differences of opinion on foreign policy, but look, we're just beginning this journey. And should I get into the race, I'll express my views about the need for a strong national defense and for an America that is consistent so that our friends know that we have their back and our enemies fear us a little bit. That's what creates peace and stability, which I think is the objective that everybody wants.
And that was before Rand Paul talked. Anthony, I'm curious for your take on that.
Yeah, well, right away you think 6 in 10 Republicans say that they wouldn't vote for somebody, wouldn't even consider somebody who disagreed with them on how to handle ISIS. So when you hear Governor Bush mention foreign policy right out of the gate, I mean, that's clearly someplace where his rivals will probably go after Rand Paul for all the reasons that I think John illustrated well. But at the same time, you know, there's also a threshold sometimes for candidates. You don't necessarily have to be the best on a given policy. You just have to meet certain requirements. And so if he can establish, as I think he tried to do in the speech, a certain toughness, certainly the Obama administration gives him a target to go after on that, and then move on to other things where he can really differentiate himself, like John said, also on matters of liberty. And I think, too, this idea that economic prosperity, as he said, is trying to lift up everybody, it makes it seem much more like a philosophy and more ideological, like a belief, and less political in that vein, too.
Yeah, Steve, the governor made those comments before the comments that Rand Paul just made, but we were talking during the speech that, was there anything in his announcement that struck you as not common in the Republican Party overall?
I mean, I mentioned it earlier. This economic populism is, but I think using the two Americas and the African American examples is definitely not something you hear a lot of Republicans talking about. And that was sort of interesting to me. It's going to be interesting to me too. We talk about these pillars: the economy, foreign policy. What is going to be the bigger issue this year? I mean, if it's foreign policy, Rand Paul has a larger hill to climb on this.
For sure.
And so that's going to be, and that's why you saw Jeb Bush sort of say what he said, which is, I mean, no one's going to disagree with him that pretty much every Republican that's running wants limited government and freedom, but it's where the foreign policy, where they are in foreign policy is where the real debate's going to happen. How important is that going to be for Republican voters this year? And if it's the top issue, that's a big issue for a big problem for Rand Paul, maybe.
Yeah, well, I think ISIS really has thrown a wrench into that, because I think we heard a lot about the economy first, but we're also going to have to hear about foreign policy. And you also mentioned, Steve and John, I'm curious about your take. These speeches, we can hear everything, but it really is going to come down to the debate once all of the candidates are up there against each other to really see how they separate themselves from the pack.
That's right, and we've seen some really interesting things about debates recently, which is to say that the Iranian gambit that President Obama is trying to sell to the country and to Congress right now is really a promise kept from his primary debates back in 2008. Well, actually, his general election debate was with John McCain, a debate about arguing over Pakistan, and then he argued with Hillary Clinton about meeting with Iranians with no preconditions. And so the debates in 2008, in which Barack Obama outlined his position on Pakistan and acting on intelligence, even if Pakistan didn't know the U.S. was going to operate in the country, and then also what he's done now on Iran, those are two things that came right out of the debates in that period. And so the debates will be an opportunity for these distinctions to get sharpened and for candidates to really lean out and lean into their policy positions, which not only give voters an idea what they'll do, but what we're now seeing with Barack Obama really is kind of a template for what they might do in office.
All right, John Dickerson, we've had an amazing discussion. Steve Chaggaris, Anthony Salvanto, we've had an amazing discussion about Rand Paul and about all the possible potential Republican contenders, and we talked a little bit about Hillary Clinton as well. So we can already see that this is going to be a super exciting campaign season. Thank you guys all for being a part of it.